It was in the summer of 1910 that Howard Phillips Lovecraft made one of his exceedingly rare journeys away from his beloved Rhode Island, said farewell to his mother and father, and embarked not quite on a European tour, the way many wealthy Americans did in that day and age, but an abbreviated version of it, for he was to visit not the whole of Europe, but simply Britain, to visit his English cousin, Marcus Rushbridger, who lived in London. The journey was made, it was long and exhausting. Lovecraft had never been in the best of health, and certainly the travel across from America took its toll upon him, and in his diaries he wrote about the unpleasant experience, both in terms of the impact of the sea journey, the crossing, making him feel remarkably nauseous, but also the somewhat unpleasant company of the fellow guests aboard the cruise. But to London he arrived, there to be greeted by cousin Marcus, and a wonderful time was had of it for 2 long weeks. They saw Windsor Castle, they saw Buckingham Palace, they saw Madame Tussauds, they saw one tourist trap after another, and Lovecraft imbibed the culture, imbibed the sense of being part of something ancient and traditional and elite. For Lovecraft was, to his very core, something of a snob. As indeed was Marcus, cousin Marcus, who thoroughly enjoyed entertaining his American cousin, showing him the sights and the sounds, being able to point to a door and say, that door in that building is older than your entire country. Managing to say it with only a trace of smugness and condescension in the process. But once the sights of London itself were enjoyed and entertained and imbibed, Lovecraft grew perhaps a little restless. He was not one for the big city life. Providence he adored and enjoyed, but London was on a scale that simply dwarfed Providence into insignificance. And the smoke and the noise and the presence of so many people from so many different parts of the world talking so many languages, and the aromas of so many different foods from restaurants and cafes and street vendors and all manner of other purveyors, it all became a little bit overwhelming for Lovecraft. He yearned for something simpler and said as much to cousin Marcus. I've seen the town, now show me the country. And so cousin Marcus discussed various places that they could go, none of which, of course, Lovecraft had ever heard of. But one particular caught his fancy somewhat, for cousin Marcus said, we have, you and I, very distant ancestry going back to the county of Suffolk. And indeed, I believe there is a Suffolk county, if not possibly several Suffolk counties in America, named after our Suffolk in England, named by people going over on the Mayflower and various other ships. There is an Ipswich in America, not far from Salem. There is all manner of places named after all manner of locations, which our ancestors would have lived in and known and, well, hopefully loved, possibly hated, but hopefully loved. One such place, said cousin Marcus, is down on the Suffolk coast. A tiny little town. You could scarcely get anywhere more rural than Dunwich, and indeed when I say it's a town, really it's just a village. It used to be a town, once upon a time, and therein lies a story. And Marcus, like Lovecraft himself, was a weaver of tales, only marginally more successful than Lovecraft, at least in his own lifetime, for like many a poet, many an artist, Lovecraft's true wealth and fame and success came when he was far too dead to enjoy any of it. Cousin Marcus fared a little better, but only a little. And sparked by this supposed tale that he was to hear, and indeed see the very places within the tale unfurl before him, Lovecraft said, "Take me. Let's go in the car. Let's pack a picnic. Let's journey forth." And that is exactly what they did. Cousin Marcus had his servant, his man, pack up a lunch for them. They put the basket in the back of the car, and off they drove on a wonderful midsummer's day. Mile after mile after mile, because of course cars were somewhat slower back in 1910 than they are these days. And so a journey that might take a couple of hours these days took, well, almost half a day back in 1910, going round the country lanes, some of them blocked by cattle, some blocked by sheep as farmers led their livestock from one field to another, gaggles of geese occasionally breaking free, ducks from ponds wandering into the middle of the road as the cars whizzed past, sending them squawking and flapping in every which direction. But it was a lovely day. The sun was up, the sky was blue, and they were thoroughly enjoying it. They stopped here and there for a drink at a wayside inn, perhaps a sandwich or two on the way, until eventually they came to Dunwich itself. They drove through the winding lanes, going further and further into what seemed to Lovecraft, well, oblivion is perhaps too strong a word, but he felt as if he was going into the back of beyond. So eventually they passed on the right-hand side the ruins of an ancient abbey that had stood there, the Greyfriars Abbey, now reduced to a few walls and a few great scattered stones that had once rung with the hymns and the chanting and the singing and the Latin plain chant of the Greyfriars themselves. And there, as they came into the village proper, was the Ship Inn. And in 1910, just as these days, it was a place that had rooms to rent as well as a friendly bar in which to purchase food and drink. And so it was getting quite late in the day and they knew it was a long drive back. They decided they would stay over a night so they could enjoy some social niceties in the pub that very evening and maybe go for an evening stroll down upon the beach. And then the next day in the morning when it was nice and bright they could explore further. Lovecraft particularly wanted to see those medieval ruins in rather more detail. It was once they'd finished their meal and were enjoying a drink or two, although Lovecraft, like many an American, found British beer something of an acquired taste, particularly the temperature at which it was served, that Cousin Marcus fell to regaling Cousin Howard with stories of Dunwich itself, of how once upon a time, centuries and centuries and centuries ago, this tiny little village had been much, much, much larger and in fact had stretched far out, pointing indeed towards the sea. They took their drinks with them and they wandered down. It was only a couple of minutes' walk to where they could see the waves crashing upon the shingle and see the fishermen's boats moored for the evening. "See over there," said Cousin Marcus, pointing to the waves. "Once Dunwich was a great thriving medieval town filled with traders and merchants and churches and butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and all manner of people coming and going, but not here, not where the pub is, but out there in the waters. For once the land stretched out much further than it does these days. Gradually, without any great cataclysm or any terrible event of the sort, simply gradual erosion, a little by a little by a little, the waves ate away at the cliffs, and Cousin Marcus pointed to where the cliffs were now. Those cliffs used to stretch out much further. They've fallen and fallen, and indeed, even as he was pointing, there was a very small fall of soil from one of the cliffs. Perhaps some seabird had landed awkwardly and dislodged a few stones, and it scattered down to settle amongst the shingle upon the beach. "They say," said Cousin Marcus, "that at certain times of the year, when the wind is right, you can hear the tolling of a bell coming from far out in the ocean wave, where the church that once was there is now upon the ocean bed, and the bell swings within the tower still, but only at certain times of year." And of course the two of them had a good laugh at this rather quaint rural superstition. But nonetheless, as their conversation drifted into an amenable silence, and the two men stood watching as the moon began to rise over the distant horizon, and the stars began to make themselves felt in the sky, casting their light down upon the waves, they felt as if it might not be so implausible after all, that a church bell could be heard out, tolling upon the ocean bed. But it had been a long drive and a long day, and they'd had a few drinks, possibly one or two too many, and they felt sleep catching up with them. And so they strolled back, chattering of this and that, to the rooms they had booked, 2 adjacent rooms in the Ship Inn. Up the ancient stairs they creaked, into the bed which was not to the standard that Lovecraft was used to, but after a long drive and a few drinks he was sufficiently tired to think, well, he could slum it for an evening. He undressed and put on his stripiest pyjamas, and laying down upon the slightly lumpy mattress, and began slowly to drift and drift and drift, until a noise startled him awake. And at first he thought maybe he had dreamt it. And after a minute or two of nothingness, and he thought, no, I definitely must have dreamt that. It started again, a scratching, and he looked up expecting to see a mouse, or worse yet, a rat. He lit the candle by the bedside. He looked around. Nothing. No rodent, nothing. The scratching came again, and straining his ears the way a dog will, tilting left and right, he tracked the noise, not under the bed, not behind the wardrobe, but to a plain piece of the wall. For the noise was coming from within the wall. The rodent, mouse or rat, and it sounded rather large to be merely a mouse, seemed to be dwelling within the wall itself. And of course, a lot of these very old buildings, being wood timbered, often have cavities and gaps within the walls where creatures will get. Sometimes cats will climb into them and eventually be found centuries later mummified, and mice get into them, and perhaps, judging from the sound, and it began to move along the wall, not just stay in one place. This rat, or whatever it might be, had got somehow into a cavity in the wall. One of the many, many things which Lovecraft despised were rodents. The prospect of sharing a bedchamber with some gnawing, twitching, diseased thing was too much to bear, and he thought of going down to bang upon the door of the landlord and ask him to do something about it. But looking at his watch, he saw that it was near 2 in the morning, and even though he was an international traveller, he felt a little rude, imposing. And after all, what could the landlord do? He could scarcely rip panels off the wall to get at the rodent. Well, certainly not at 2 in the morning. And he resolved to try and go back to sleep and forget the noise. But on and on and on it went, and toss and turn and put the pillow over his head to try and block out his ears as he might. The sound scurried around and around and sometimes seemed to go up the walls, not simply around and around the walls. At one point, it even seemed to be coming from within the ceiling itself, and he wondered if maybe there was an attic up there and the rats were going from the attic down into the wall cavities somehow. And he simply could not sleep. As he sat there wondering if maybe he would simply have to wake the landlord up, he heard the distant tolling of a bell. A church bell. There was a church in the village, but no one would be there at, well, 2:30, almost 2:45 in the morning, tolling a bell. That was nonsense. Was it perhaps a boy floating out in the sea? But the tolling came again, and it was definitely a church bell. Lovecraft was very familiar with church bells, and this was indeed a bell within a church tower, not a boy floating in the ocean. And the story which his cousin had told him came back. And the rats in the walls started again, and he thought to himself, maybe if I go for a walk, maybe if I go for a little stroll, this is not New York, this is not some crime-rattled city where I have to take my life in my hands. This is a gentle little village in the English countryside. The worst thing here is some bad-tempered retired colonel, and I'm not even going to meet him at 3 in the morning. I am perfectly safe going for a stroll out in the streets. The pub never shut its doors. He could get out and get back in again quite easily enough. This was the kind of village where nobody needed to lock their doors, for crime was non-existent. And so he wrapped his dressing gown round him and put on his shoes, and yawning he wandered out, quietly creeping down the stairs, out through the bar, through the saloon, and out into the streets. And once he was outside, thankfully that wretched scratching became a distant memory. But the tolling of the bell grew louder, and it was definitely coming from over the sea, not from the church in the village over yonder, but from the sea. And Lovecraft, remembering the way down, for it was only a couple of hours since he'd been there, took the few short minute walk down towards the shingle, clambered up past the great dark shapes of the moored boats that were upon the shingle shore. There was enough moonlight for him to be able to walk safely without tripping over anchors or ropes or anything of the sort. And he looked towards the sea, and there he could hear quite loudly, quite distinctly, the bong, bong, bong of the bell. And even as he listened, he could see a sea mist rolling in and rolling in, rolling in, getting thicker and thicker, and blocking out even the sight of the sea itself, even blocking out the sight of some of those boats that were moored upon the shingle. Rowboats, nothing grand, nothing huge, just humble rowboats, but blocking the shapes out. And he began to think, if this mist gets any thicker, well, I could easily trip over a rope. I could trip headlong over one of these rowboats in the gloom and have an accident. I could hurt myself. For he had always been something of a fastidious creature when it came to his own health and safety. And he began to feel a little unnerved. Sea mists were nothing unusual, but nonetheless one doesn't want to end up plunging headlong into a rowboat in the half three in the morning. And so he began to try and pick his way back where he had come from, but the mists were now so thick he wasn't entirely sure which direction he'd come from in. Was it to the left or to the right? Was it forward? Was it backwards? He looked up trying to get a sense of where the moon had been, but the mist was now so thick he couldn't even see the moon or the stars. He felt as if he were contained almost in a smoke-filled cave. And the noise of the church bell got louder and louder. and his heart began to beat a little faster and a little faster, for he was a nervous sort of a creature. And he thought to himself, well, if I wander in the wrong direction towards the sea, the worst that's going to happen is that I will get wet shoes, which will at least dry out tomorrow. And if I know where the sea is in one direction, I simply walk back in the other, and eventually I will find the street back to the pub. And so he wandered, and encountered not the street, nor indeed even the sea. The first thing he encountered, after a minute or so of wandering, was to thump into a door of a building, a damp door, a slightly rotted door. Indeed, bits of it flaked away on his hands as he touched, and standing back, the mists began to clear just enough that he could see the door properly, and the handle and the window to one side of the door, and a building which 5 minutes ago had not been there. He'd been on a beach with no buildings at all. And he began to wonder how far he'd got lost in the mists. Quite where was he? And there was another building next to it, and another and another. He was on a street, but not the street leading to the pub. And all of the houses were damp, not simply damp from the sea mist, but some of them were positively dripping. And as he touched them, the plaster and the wood would come away in his hands and leave unpleasant smears. And some of them had, well, was it seaweed? Was it mould? Was it lichen? What was it growing upon these buildings? And oh, the smell, that terrible, pungent smell of rotting wood and damp plaster and, rotting fish and other things that were just too rancid to even identify. But the floor beneath him was cobblestones, no longer shingle. And he could swear that the road he had walked down earlier the evening as they strolled to and from the pub had not been cobbled. So quite where was he? And something up ahead whispered. The bell of the church, which was louder and louder now, because clearly he was getting closer and closer to the church, was still tolling. But there was a voice. Could it have been the wind? Groaning in the eaves? But it sounded like a voice. What was it saying? And again, a hint, a whisper, an almost, but not quite noise coming from somewhere up ahead. Lovecraft called out, "Who's there? Who is it? I'm a visitor to your shores. I'm lost. I don't know where I am. I'm trying to get back to the pub, to the Ship Inn." And there, after another 10 yards or so, the mist cleared sufficiently well that he could see the shape of the church up ahead. And it did not look like the glimpse of the church he had had earlier in the day as they'd driven into the village. But the tolling of the bell was most certainly coming from this church. And the door to the church was ajar. And he did not think seriously that there would be anyone in the church at gone 3 a.m, but perhaps as just somewhere to sit and to wait and to get his breath back and to wait for his heart to slow down a little and stop racing, to calm himself down, to collect his thoughts. Maybe just sitting in the church would be the thing to do. And so he wandered up and he pushed the door open, and that church door was as rancid as all of the other doors and walls that he'd touched on his wanderings through the village. And there were lights flickering inside the church, candle lights. There were candles lit, candles upon the distant altar, candles upon the shrines to various saints, at alcoves stationed around the church. And as he entered the church, his feet, shoes echoing upon the flagstones, he caught again a sense of that noise, that whisper, but louder now. And what did it say? Feed me. Feed me. Who is it? Who's there? What was it? Was it some awful choir boy playing a nasty prank? Some village idiot indulging their bizarre sense of humour? Feed me. The voice was too deep for a choir boy. It had an air of intelligence about it that seemed ill-suited to a village idiot. Feed me. The voice grew louder as the tolling of the bell grew louder. And up ahead in the candlelight he could see something moving, some large shadow moving about. Was it the shadow it was cast upon the wall, or was it the source of the shadow itself that he was seeing? Something large and lumpen and shambling and moving, and he could hear the dragging of feet. He hoped it was feet coming closer and closer. Feed me. It was too much for Lovecraft, far too much for so delicate a gentleman. He turned tail and fled, stumbling and banging his knees against one of the church pews, reaching eventually the door as the voice got louder and louder. Feed me. And something he could have sworn was reaching out, grasping at his dressing gown, something dank and rancid. He pulled open the church door, taking a great chunk of the wood with him, and ran, fleeing out into the street, screaming, dreaming, turning what he hoped was the correct direction back the way he'd come. And he ran, and he ran, and he ran, and the sea mist seemed to be getting thicker and thicker and thicker, and where he'd been able to see the houses and the doors and the windows on his walk down towards the church, now he could hardly see anything but the great knotting tendrils of sea mist wrapping around, which seemed all too solid and thickening, no longer just mist, but tripping him, grasping at him, pulling at his clothing, pulling at his hair, leaving slimy trails upon his skin. He was screaming, he was gibbering, he was calling. The church bell beat louder and louder and louder, and whatever it was that was coming out of the church behind him grew louder and louder. Feed me! He ran and he ran and he ran until the cobblestones beneath his feet gave way to cold, cold, cold seawater lapping up around his knees, tripping and stumbling, falling headlong, coughing and spluttering into the sea itself. The cobblestones gone, the walls of the houses gone, the windows, the doors gone. Just sea and sea and sea, and the mist started to dissipate, and there was the moon and the stars, and it was casting enough light that he could see the shingle and the shadows of the rowboats but 7 or 8 yards away from him. And he staggered, shivering and shaking and terrified, out of the dank ocean, made his way up the shingle, coughing and spluttering, looking about him all of the time to see if the thing from within the church was still there, but he could see nothing. To see if the buildings were still there, if the church itself was still there, but he could see nothing aside from the shingle and the rowboats and the ocean wave. And at length, staggering and stumbling, he made his way back to the familiar site of the ship inn, and leaving trails of seawater and muddy puddles and sand and perhaps the odd starfish behind him, he staggered through the pub, up the stairs, caring nothing for whether he caused the stairs to creak and groan, whether he clonked and thumped with his now soggy shoes, into his bed, threw off his rancid damp clothing, and fell naked into the sheets. And if there was any scratching in the walls, he slept far too deeply to hear it. When he awoke in the morning, or was shaken awake in the morning, by his cousin Marcus saying, "Breakfast is ready, old man. They're getting ready to put the breakfast things away. You must come." "Good Lord, you look terrible," his cousin said to him, as Lovecraft, bleary-eyed, woke up and looked around him. Oh, what a dream! What a nightmare! What an awful, awful experience! You shouldn't have told me that dreadful story about the sinking of Dunwich, the old medieval town. I had such a terrible dream in the night," said Lovecraft, sitting up, his stomach bilious, feeling as if he had drunk the bar dry, until Cousin Marcus picked up the dressing gown and said, "Good God, man, what did you get up to in the night?" And he held the sopping wet rag up, which was covered in sand and shells and the detritus of the ocean. And there the wet shoes, and there the wet pyjamas, cast hither and yon about the room. Well, Lovecraft could not keep the breakfast down, and as soon as his cousin Marcus had finished shoveling enough food for the pair of them down his throat, off they went in the car. No more time spent in the village of Dunwich. Lovecraft did not want to know how quaint and pretty the cottages were, how lovely the thatched roofs were, let alone how beautiful the stained glass windows in the church were. He wanted to go back to London. Actually, he wanted to go back to Providence, but London first. And he could barely speak to his cousin on the journey back, plagued by the thoughts of what he had seen in the night. And did the horror of Dunwich, which wanted to be fed, get fed? Well, it may not have eaten the flesh and the blood of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, but it ate away at his mind, ate and ate, driving him madder and madder, until he penned tales of lurid purple prose, of dark and terrible things from the ocean depths, of monstrous beings and entities from beyond the stars, of things that lurk between the dimensions, eating away at the innocent and the naive and the foolish, as well as the greedy and the corrupt and the wise. Ate away at him until he died an early death in his mid-40s. But that is another story and the end of this one. Thank you.